All right, we are now live once again on Facebook. Facebook, welcome. Glad you stayed with us for our second portion here, for those of you that are with us. So we are going into our second portion here. And again, glad that you are here with us. Let me just turn this off here so I don't repeat myself. Okay, good. Let's pray, and then we're going to get into our message. So Father, we thank you so much that we can study your word this morning. We ask that you give us the spirit of wisdom, the spirit of understanding, the spirit of counsel. Lead us and guide us into your truth, because it is your truth which makes us free. We've done all that we could do in studying, Father, so we just ask you to continue to lead us and guide us in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are talking about who's the boss still, the never-ending sermon, as a friend of mine calls it, women and men in biblical and cultural context. We are finally on to what we've talked about 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12. Now we're moving on to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and verse 14. So last week I shared with you the complementarian view of verse 13. So let's go and read that. And actually, let's start at verse 11. Paul says in verse 11 of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. Verse 12, and I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Verse 13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. Verse 14, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. We're going to be talking about those two passages, verse 13 and 14. What in the world is Paul talking about? And I'm going to share with you the complementarian view, especially of verse 14, and also the egalitarian view or views of verse 13 and 14, because I shared the complementarian view of verse 13 last week. They basically and primarily, I won't go into it in great detail, you can go back and see the video, but they see that the fact that God says that Adam was formed first and then Eve, that this establishes Adam's leadership over Eve, and by extension, they see it as establishing the headship of men over women, and of men only being allowed to teach in the church, having authority, pastoral authority, or the authority of an elder, and especially having it over other men, and that this is denied to women. So when Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man, they see verse 13, for Adam was formed first and then Eve, as being Paul given the reason why. Why can't women teach or have authority over men? It is because of what they say, the creation order. Now, I've been saying, and other egalitarian teachers have been saying, that this is not the reason why, that it was because of the false teaching going on in the church. I've shared with you that there were wealthy women in the church who had embraced the false teaching, that these wealthy women, because of their attitude, because of their pride, because of their arrogance, and because of the dishonoring behavior that they were engaged in because of the false teaching, that this is why Paul says that they are not allowed to teach. Complementarians say, no, that's not the reason why. Yeah, it may be true that there was false teaching. Yeah, it may be true that these women were engaged in behavior that was wrong, but this is not the reason. Paul roots the reason for them not being able to teach and to have authority over men, as they see it, as pastoral authority or being the authority of an elder. They're not to have that over men, because Paul, as complementarians will say, roots this in the creation order, or the created, or the creational order, or creation order, that God created men first, then he created the man first, then he created the woman, and because of that order, man first, woman, this establishes from creation, has nothing to do with the fall, it establishes from creation that men are supposed to lead, not women. They're to lead in the home, they're to lead in the church. Women can lead other women and children, but not lead other men. This is the complementarian view. Some complementarians believe that this extends even to society, that men are supposed to have the lead in government and not women. There are some who teach, not all complementarians, but there are some complementarians who believe this extends to Bible colleges and universities, that women are not allowed to teach men, in no matter how educated they are, no matter how many degrees they may have, no matter how capable they may be, that they are not supposed to teach men in seminaries or Bible universities where men are being prepared for pastoral leadership, women are not supposed to do that. So, and they base it off of the fact that God, and they'll say, God put this, and he based this on the creation order. So this is rooted in creation. This is from creation. So they see this as a universal, and they call it a transcultural principle. This is a universal principle. It applies to all people in every place at all times. And it's not just based upon what was happening at Ephesus. It wasn't based upon the historical situation. It wasn't based upon culture. This was a universal transcultural, which this is what they mean by transcultural. It transcends the culture and it's universal. So it's not limited to the historical circumstances of what was taking place at Ephesus. And again, they see this because it says Adam was formed first and then Eve. Okay, so and they often tend to root this in, as we said last week, the principle of primogeniture, the principle of primogeniture. Now, as I shared with you last week, primogeniture just does not work. I'm not going to go over everything. Just go back and look at the video from last week. Primogeniture, for many different reasons, when you go and look at it in the ancient Near East, pre-Torah, before primogeniture was established within a Torah, when it's just part of the ancient Near Eastern culture, it just doesn't work to say that Adam was the firstborn. Adam is never called the firstborn within Scripture. Also, I didn't share this last week, and I had prepared something. I thought I won't jump into it because it'll take too long. But primogeniture was not really commonly or practiced widely in the first century Greco-Roman culture. I went back and did a little bit more research just to confirm my thoughts about this. And I won't go into all the research, but one of the scholars that I quoted last week, Q Sop Kim, I think I pronounced his name wrong last week. I went and looked it up so I could pronounce it correctly. But Q Sop Kim, Dr. Q Sop Kim, he wrote a book called The Firstborn Son in Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity. He looked at this, and what he concluded was that, quote, the prerogatives of the, am I recording? Okay. Let me go back for just a second. Where is it at here? Well, what he showed, oh yeah, here it is. The prerogatives of the eldest son in inheritance was not supported by Greco-Roman legal rules. Therefore, we conclude that primogeniture was uncommon in the Greco-Roman world. It wasn't that it didn't exist, but it was not practiced like it was in the ancient Near East. So my point here is this. Paul was not, when he says Adam was created first, Paul was not referring to the ancient Near Eastern concept of primogeniture. See the video from last week, it just doesn't work. Nor was he referring to a first century concept of primogeniture, because the way it was practiced in the first century, the way inheritance were given, it was not encoded in law, and it was usually not always, it really wasn't a common practice to give your inheritance to your eldest son if you were the father and you died. It's not the way it worked. The inheritance would be spread out among the children, even among the daughters. So it wasn't just the sons who got an inheritance, the daughters got it also, and it would be distributed, quote, equally, end quote. The reason I say quote, end quote, because equally as they defined it back then was based upon your situation in life. So the father would say, let's say I had 2 sons, 2 daughters, I'm going to distribute it, if I was the father, I'm going to distribute it equally, but equally will be based upon what's the situation of each child. So one might get a little more than another based upon their situation. So one of the daughters might get a little bit more than the son based upon her situation, or vice versa. So primogeniture was not practiced in a common manner widely within the first century Greco-Roman world. So you cannot appeal to first century Greco-Roman practice to say, oh, well, Paul was also pulling from that. He wasn't pulling from ancient Near Eastern because of the way it worked. He wasn't pulling from first century also, or either. He wasn't pulling from that. So let's go on, because I got a lot to cover today, and I pray that I am able to get to all of it. So let's talk about 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. Again, let me read it. And actually, I need to put it in context. Verse 11, let a woman learn in silence with all submission, And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was created first and then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Now, if there's one thing that egalitarian scholars say is that this passage of scripture, actually the entire passage of scripture, but especially when you're getting into verse 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, they are really difficult to interpret. There are those who go, and I'll say this not as a way of being derisive of him, but I've heard Mike Winger say, "Oh, well, this passage it's fairly clear what it's stating here." And there are some other complementarians who say that, but when you start to get into the Greek of the passage, practically every scholars, even the egalitarian scholars and other scholars, have said this passage is extremely difficult to interpret because of the complexities of the language. So those who say, oh, well, this is simple, this means you're not reading it in the original language, or you're not studying those who have studied it in the original language, because they will tell you this passage is complex. You've got to do a lot of work. And there are those who will say, if they come from an egalitarian point of view, or you're just going through a lot of mental gymnastics to try to make the text say what it doesn't say. No, they're looking at the text and they're recognizing the complexity of the text, which we have to acknowledge that, okay? So let's look at first the complementarian view of verse 14. We know verse 13 says that Adam was formed first, then Eve. This is seen again as given the reason why women are not allowed to teach, because Adam came first and then Eve. And then verse 13 says, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Now, what is the complementarian view of this passage, verse 14? It used to be, it was held for actually centuries, even before the term complementarian was coined in, I think it was the late 1970s or 80s. Before that term was coined, this was a view of women that was held for centuries by early church fathers and pastors down through the centuries up until about the 1960s. And the view was this. The view was that Eve and all women are more easily deceived than men. This is why women are not allowed to teach, because Eve was deceived, thus women are more easily deceived than men. As I said, this was a view that was held for centuries by complementarians and by early church fathers, patriarchalists, it was being held up until about the 1960s. Dr. Wayne Grudem, in his book, Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth, in his book, he refers to and kind of holds to that view in this book, Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth. He offers a slightly modified view, I should say, of this concept that women are more easily deceived than men. He also offers a slightly modified view. Let me read to you from page 72 of the book. And when he talks about why women are not allowed to teach, based up, as it says in chapter 2, verse 12, his complementarian explanation says this. He says, quote, this explanation seems to me to best suit the wording in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14. Paul is saying that women should not teach or have authority over men in the congregation of God's people for two reasons. One, because God gave Adam a leadership role when he created him first and Eve second. That's verse 13. Two, God gave men in general a disposition that is better suited to teaching and governing in the church. A disposition that inclines more to rational, logical analysis of doctrine and a desire to protect the doctrinal purity of the church. And God gave women, in general, a disposition that inclines more towards a rational, nurturing emphasis that places a higher value on unity and community in the church. He goes on to say, both emphases are needed, of course, and both men and women have some measure of both tendencies, but Paul understands the kinder, gentler, more rational, more relational nature of women as something that let me read again. Paul understands the kinder, gentler, more relational nature of women as something that made Eve less inclined to oppose the deceptive serpent and more inclined to accept his words as something helpful and true. And he extends this to women. Now, it's a more modified view, but it's still saying that there is something in women that inclines them more to being deceived than men. Okay, so this is a view. And in the book Recovering Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, he and John Piper give an even more modified and nuanced view. Let me read to you from, I got a lot of books up here today. Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. They give a more refined view of this, a more nuanced view of this in their book. And I want to be fair to them as to how they are saying it. So on page 89 of the book, this is what they say. There's a question: do you think women are more gullible than men? They write, 1 Timothy 2:14 says, Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Actually, it says, and she became a transgressor, she transgressed. And that's important because sinner and transgression, or transgression, not necessarily the same thing. Paul gives this as one of the reasons why he does not permit women to teach or have authority over a man. Historically, this has usually been taken to mean that women are more gullible or deceivable than men, and therefore less fit for the doctrinal oversight of the church. Now, we just read where he at one point espoused that view. This may be true, okay? This is what they say in the book. This may be true. However, we are attracted to another understanding of Paul's argument. We think that Satan's main target was not Eve's peculiar gullibility, if she had one, but rather Adam's headship as the one ordained by God to be responsible for the life of the garden. Satan's subtlety is that he knew the created order God had ordained for the good of the family, and he deliberately defied it by ignoring the man and taking up his dealings with the women. Let me say this. One of the things I will be covering is complementarian objections to egalitarian views on this passage that we're covering. We're not going to get into all of it today. I will touch on it lightly. But one of the things that you will see complementarian scholars say over and over when an egalitarian presents their views, well, that's not in the text. The text doesn't say that. So that can't be right. That can't be true. That's not plausible because the text doesn't say that. Yet at the same time, they will say things that are not in the text. For instance, when Dr. Grudem and Dr. Piper say here, Satan's subtlety is that he knew the created order God had ordained for the good of the family, and he deliberately defied it by ignoring the man and taking up his dealings with the woman. How do we know that Satan knew that God creating Adam first and Eve second, that this had to do with the created order of God for the family, when the text never says that, when the text never has God saying, yeah, I'm creating Adam first for the good of the family, and Satan could hear, or he tells Satan that. Nowhere in all of the Bible do we have God saying that. And my point here is that you will constantly hear, or read, I should say, and as we deal with some of the objections, I will bring this up. You will read complement scholars and authors saying, yeah, but the text doesn't say that. The text doesn't say that, in response to egalitarian scholars. And yet they will do the same thing. Like here, it says, we think that Satan's main target was not Eve's peculiar gullibility, but rather is Adam's headship as the one ordained by God to be responsible for the life of the garden. But nowhere in the text does it say that. That is something that they are inferring based upon the belief that men are supposed to be the head. So they're taking their interpretation, reading it into the text and saying, this is what the text is about. It was the serpent attacking Adam's headship, but they're presupposing that their interpretation and their view of headship is correct. They're reading into the text and then reading out of the text their own view. So I just want to say that. Okay, let me go back to what I was saying, because that's going to be important as we deal with some other things. Satan's subtlety is that he knew the created order God had ordained for the good of the family. He deliberately defied it by ignoring the man and taking up his dealings with the women. Satan put her in the position of spokesman, leader, and defender. Again, the text doesn't say that. At that moment, both the man and the woman slipped from their innocence and let themselves be drawn into a pattern of relating to that to this day has proved destructive. Then they go on, and another question is asked that they put forward. And this is probably questions that they've gotten over the years, but it does look like as if Paul really thought Eve was somehow more vulnerable to deception than Adam. Wouldn't this make Paul a culpable chauvinist? Okay. They write, no, when someone asks if women are weaker than men or smarter than men, or more easily frightened than men, or something like that, perhaps the best way to answer is this. Women are weaker in some ways, and men are weaker in some ways. Women are smarter in some ways, and men are smarter in some ways. Women are more easily frightened in some circumstances, and men are more easily frightened in others. It is dangerous to put negative values on the so-called weaknesses that each of us has. Now, I agree with that. They go on to say in another paragraph, even if 1 Timothy 2:14 meant that in some circumstances, women are characteristically more vulnerable to deception, that would not settle anything about the equality or worth of manhood and womanhood. Now, they're still holding verse 14 as a possibility that women, as they put it here, that in some circumstances, women are characteristically more vulnerable to deception than men are. Now, the problem with this is the Bible says very simply, the woman was deceived and the man was not. It does not say the woman, Eve, in some circumstances, Eve is characteristically more vulnerable than Adam. It doesn't say that. It just says the woman is deceived. In other words, they had to add more into this to make this nuanced. And I'm glad they nuanced it, but it's not being true to the text, okay? So they're still holding as a possible meaning that this verse can be read to mean that women might be more deceived than men. Now, like I said, this was a view that was held for many, many years. It's not really held by many complementarians now, though they do hold that open as a possibility. But as I said, 1 Timothy 2:14 does not say that Eve and thus women in some situations are more vulnerable or characteristically more vulnerable to deception than men. This view, though, is, for the most part, rejected by complementarians today. Now, I think there are some ultra-patriarchalists who do hold to that view, but most complementarians, whether they're what you call a one-point complementarian or a two-point complementarian, do not hold to this view. Let me read to you from the book, How God Sees Women, by Taryn Williams, one of my favorite books. On page 140, he talks about this. So let me read to you what Taryn says. I think he gives a good summary of this. There we go. Taryn says in the book, which if you haven't gotten this book or read it, I highly recommend it. He says, having read many complementarian scholars, I have noticed that they put the weight of their argument for the creation order on verse 13, which I suggest they have misread as Adam's rank above Eve. And again, I also agree with him in that. I think that's a misreading of the text. But then they typically admit that they are less certain about verse 14. And you do see this. You do see some complementarian authors currently, as they write about verse 14, they're not sure what to make of that. So they tend to focus on verse 13 and kind of leave verse 14 alone in terms of what does this verse actually mean. Let me go on and read what he says here. He said there are one of two ways they interpret this verse. The first is that Eve, as well as her daughters, is more vulnerable to deception than Adam and his sons, and therefore women are not suitable spiritual leaders and teachers. The second, espoused first by George Knight in 1977, is that Eve cooperated with Satan by sidestepping Adam's rightful authority over Eve. The idea here, we're going to be talking about this a little bit later, is that Eve stepped into and took she usurped Adam's authority. She took the leadership role that Adam was supposed to be in. George Knight in 1977, according to Taryn here, is the one who proposed this. He goes on to say, is a woman easier to deceive than a man? Up until the 1960s, this was the church's proof text for close on 2 millennia, almost for 2,000 years, for female inferiority, including her lacking intellectual ability. But the women's liberation movement upended that cultural assumption, and pretty much all thinking Christians abandoned it too. This is why hardly any complementarian scholars who have rightly replaced the idea of female inferiority with female equality opt for this interpretation. So like I said before, very few, if any, complementarians hold to the view today that verse 14 is teaching that women are more gullible than men, therefore more open to deception than men, therefore women cannot be teachers, because that would imply that women do not have the intellectual capacity. But as we've seen in Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and in the book Evangelical Feminism and Biblical Truth, they are still holding that out as a possibility, not right out saying it. Like I said, it's more nuanced, modified, but still a possibility. And I just think that is wrong. That is just wrong. But it is rejected by most complementarians today. Okay, so that is one view of verse 14. For the most part, in the complementarian world today, that is a rejected view, that women are more easily deceived by men. A second view, which Taryn alluded to, was that Eve was deceived. Her deception lie in leaving her place of submission under Adam's leadership and assuming leadership over Adam, thus violating the divine or created order in verse 13. The idea again is that Adam was created first, and so Eve's deception was that she was deceived to leave her place of submission as Adam's helper, and then she stepped into a leadership role over Adam, which was Adam's role. Let me read to you again from the book, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. There is one of the contributing authors to the book, a scholar by the name of David J. Ayers. He wrote what I consider to be a pretty good summation of this complementarian view, that Eve's deception lie in the fact that she stepped out from under Adam's authority. She assumed she was deceived by the serpent to assume authority over Adam. That is what the deception was about and why she is not allowed to teach. He says on page 631, this is a footnote number 6, in case you're wondering. It is obvious from the text of Genesis that Eve encouraged wrongdoing when she gave Adam the fruit. It is equally obvious that she takes the leadership role in that activity and that Adam simply follows her leadership. She allows herself, though, to be drawn into the role of spokesman by the serpent. She does not turn to her husband, from whom she received God's command, Genesis 2, verses 16 through 17, where God gives the command to the man before the woman is created, and Genesis 3, 2 and 3, where the woman relays that command. She does not turn to her husband, from whom she received God's command, to ask him about what God has said and meant by his command, but rather acted unilaterally in opposition to the command that her husband had given to her. Furthermore, she leads her husband by taking the fruit and giving it to him to eat. In both Genesis 3:6 and 3:17, the remarks about the woman are not superfluous asides, even though they easily could have been left out, as an examination of the text bears out, but they are there to indicate exactly what happened and who had assumed the responsibility of making the decision to eat. The fact that Adam was following Eve's leadership and not simply deceived by the serpent is borne out by Paul's inspired, evaluative statement in 1 Timothy 2:14 that Adam was not the one deceived, it was the woman who was deceived. Thus, it seems appropriate to say that God's first comment to Adam, because you listened to your wife, is a rebuke to Adam for his failure to carry out his God-ordained leadership role, not simply a reminder to Adam that he had listened to bad advice from Eve. Let me read that again. Notice what he says here. Thus, it seems appropriate to say that God's first comment to Adam, because you listened to your wife, is a rebuke to Adam for what? For his failure to carry out his God-ordained leadership role, not simply a reminder to Adam that he had listened to his wife, that he had listened to bad advice from Eve. So according to Dr. Ayers, when God says to Adam, because you have listened to your wife, he was rebuking Adam for abdicating his leadership role and letting Eve assume the leadership. And this is what is being said in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14. It is why it is mentioned that Adam was formed first and that she was deceived, but Adam was not. Is that, though, what the text says in Genesis chapter 3? Let's go over to Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3. And let's look at the verse where God speaks to Adam. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, this is after they had partaken of the fruit. Then to Adam, God said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife, so God did say that, and have taken from the fruit of the tree which I commanded you, saying you should not eat of it, curses the ground for your sake, in toil you should eat of it all the days of your life. And then he goes on and elaborates more about what should happen. Here's the thing. God says to Adam, he says that because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying you should not eat of it. Dr. Ayers, the problem with his view is that God does not say, he says that this is God's rebuke to Adam. He says, because you've listened to your wife, that God is saying to Adam, because you did not, well, let me go back and read exactly what he said. Let me read you exactly what he said. He says, God's first comment to Adam, because you listen to your wife, is a rebuke to Adam for his failure to carry out his God-ordained leadership role. There's a problem. God never says that. God simply says to Adam, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat of it. He did not say, because you listened to your wife and abdicated your leadership role, because of that, the ground is cursed for your sake. He never says this. The focus is on Adam listening to Eve in contrast to him heeding God's command to not eat of the tree. Adam was rebuked because because he listened to Eve and ate of the tree that God told him to not eat of. He is not rebuked because he listened to Eve and abdicated his leadership position. That is not what God said to him. Once again, this is where I say complementarian scholars will get on egalitarian scholars and say, you're adding to the text what is not there. This is adding to the text what is not there. And again, it is based upon a presupposition that because Adam is created first, therefore he is the leader. So we read leadership we read the text through the lens of headship, of leadership, of patriarchy, that Adam was in charge from the beginning, when there is nothing in the text that says that, as I've argued over and over and over again. This is reading into the text what is not there. God never says anything to Adam about his leadership role. God never says anything to Adam, talking about in chapter 3 and verse 17. He never says anything to Adam about abdicating his leadership role. He says, you listened to your wife, you didn't listen to me. Your wife told you to eat of the tree. I told you not to eat of the tree. It's like, it's like when I was a kid and I would do something wrong and I would say to my grandmother, yeah, but they said, and my grandmother said, but what did I tell you? It's like God is saying, yeah, you listened to your wife, but what did I tell you? What did I tell you? It wasn't that he was following Eve's leadership and abdicating his leadership. It was like, you listen to Eve, you stop following me. That is what Adam was being rebuked for. So we cannot say that Adam abdicated his leadership, because the emphasis is on the command to not eat of the tree. No mention is made, or no mention is made or punishment or consequence for no mention is made of punishment or consequences for supposedly abdicating his leadership to Eve. And Eve is not told that she will experience her consequences because she didn't keep her place, but usurped Adam's role of leadership. That is never brought up. That has to be read into the text. You can't even infer that. You have to read that into the text. There is nothing in the text to suggest that the problem was leadership. And I have to say this to his credit. Even Mike Winger does not follow and agree with that complementarian view that Adam is being rebuked for leadership. I have to give him his props where that is concerned, that he doesn't follow that. In one of his teachings, I think it was when he taught on Genesis 3, he himself said, no, that's not there. So he and I are in agreement where that is concerned. So I disagree with the view that says that Eve was deceived by leaving her place of submission under Adam's leadership and assuming leadership over Adam. That is what the deception was, or lied in, or that's why she's not allowed to teach, because she was deceived in taking leadership that did not belong to her. And the idea is that the women in Ephesus are doing the same thing, and that any woman today, if you take on a leadership role in pastoral authority, in eldership, you are also being deceived because you're assuming leadership that doesn't belong to you. They say this is based upon the created order. They say it's based upon a creational principle. And I say no, because nothing of what is used to explain it fits the text. If we simply read the text doesn't say anything about leadership. That all has to be read into it. All right. So that's the complementarian views. And that's all the views that I could find where this was concerned. Let's go into some egalitarian views. And as I said, I'm going to just touch on some egalitarian views, deal just a little bit in some places with pushback on it. And I may say something, I will say something about that. I won't go into depth and detail. That's going to be for another lesson that I'm going to do, where I deal with objections to egalitarian views on 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 12 through 15. I would do that in more detail because it takes a lot of time, and we would be here for another 4 or 5 hours if I try to deal with everything. Okay, I'm also going to share my view of what I think this of what 1 Timothy 2:13 and 14 is saying. All right, so let's go through this. I got 5 egalitarian views that I want to share very quickly with you. Number one is that 1 Timothy chapter 2, let's go back over there again. 1 Timothy chapter 2, let's read one more time. Verse 11, we'll start with, let a woman learn in silence with all submission, and I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. Why? Or yeah, well, why? For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Eve was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Now, one egalitarian view is that this simply has to do with creation order and the violation of the creation order. And it doesn't imply anything about hierarchy of men over women, and it has nothing to do with proving that men, not women, are supposed to lead. It just has to do with a creation order, and that creation order was violated. Dr. Stanley E. Porter, in his book, The Pastoral Epistles, a commentary on the Greek text, speaks to this. This is his view. Let me read to you from this book. I've quoted from it before. Very good book. And let me say too, when I quote from a book, as you're going to see, doesn't mean that I agree with every single thing in the book. Just like I plan to write a book on this one day, and I doubt that everybody will agree with me on every single thing I read. But I'm sharing with you some interpretations, especially ones that I think these are plausible, okay? And these are different ways of being able to see it that we need to be aware of from an egalitarian point of view. So this is on page 260. This is what Dr. Porter has to say about chapter 13 and 14. He said, a much more plausible explanation is that these two verses, 13 and 14, establish that there was a disruption in the creation order, in which Eve was deceived first before Adam, and sinned before Adam sinned, which violated the creation order of Adam preceding Eve. Even if Adam was not deceived, he sinned perhaps more strikingly, but doing so willingly. The implications are that when creation order is upset, sin results. So just as men are to pray in a particular way, women are to be ordered in their behavior in both their outward appearance and their inward disposition, as we have covered verses 9 through 11. So women are to be ordered in their behavior, both in their outward appearance and their inward disposition, learning through their obedience and not teaching falsely or abusing authority, perhaps as Eve did, but teaching well and exercising appropriate authority. All right. And as I understand it, Dr. Porter does not believe that that's only limited to teaching other women and men, that women can have equal leadership authority with men in the church. So he sees this as being just a matter of the creation order that God established being violated, which resulted in sin, and that's the problem. This is why God talks about Adam being first and then Eve second, and that Eve was deceived and Adam wasn't. Just has to do with creation order. He goes on to say in another paragraph on page 260, the logic of these two verses seem to be that the major issue is orderliness, and he's still talking about 13 and 14. Adam was created first and then Eve, not Adam. Excuse me, Adam was created first and then Eve, but Eve, not Adam, was the one who was deceived first and brought transgression. The woman in some way violated the proper order by being the one who was deceived and became a transgressor first rather than Adam. And then he puts in parentheses, is there an implication that if there was to be sin, Adam should have sinned first? Okay, so Dr. Porter sees this simply as being a violation of the created order, having nothing to do with hierarchy or men being over women or women being supported in submission to men, and men are the ones who are supposed that Adam being created first means that men are to lead in the home and in the church. He doesn't see it that way. He said just has to do with created order. God established an order. And what he says is that somehow Eve violated that order. Okay. So he doesn't see this as having to do with men being over women, women not being able to teach because it violates the creation order. He sees it as saying, look, the creation order was violated, and that if women are taught properly, then they can exercise authority properly. There's not a problem with that. But what is still not answered is, why say that Adam was created and formed first and then Eve? Why say that? why this ordering? Why even bring up this ordering? And what does the order mean? Because he says Eve violated the created order. Well, what was the created order about? Adam was created first. Okay, we get that, but what is the created order about? What does it mean? What exactly about the order did Eve violate? How did she violate it? And Dr. Porter doesn't answer these questions. He just says the woman violated the proper order in some way. So with all due respect to Dr. Porter, and I have a lot of respect for him, I do not find this argument sufficient or adequate or convincing. It leaves too many questions for me, because it's like, okay, in some way she violated the order. Well, how did she violate the order? And he doesn't really go on to answer that. He just said in some way that he sees the main issue as one of orderliness. And yes, and he's interpreting it based upon the flow of the text, where women are being called into order, or as I have said, and he also argues, they're being called away from behavior that is disorderly, that is dishonoring, to behavior that is honoring and orderly according to the customs of the day and according to what God wants for his people. So as he sees that, he goes, this has to do also with order, and somehow the order is being violated. Again, I have to say though, but in what way is the order with Adam and Eve? How did Eve violate the order? What was the order? What did the order mean? What did it mean that Adam was created first, then Eve? We know that's an ordering, it's a sequence, but what does it mean? So for that, I go, I found his interpretation wanting, because it didn't answer enough questions for me. But I see his point that the passage itself from verse 8, actually starting at verse 2 all the way down to verse 15, has to do with order, okay? Or things being in their proper place, right behavior. That's what I mean by order. Okay, so that's one egalitarian view. I find it wanting. Number two, Paul was countering teachings. This is a second egalitarian view. Paul was countering teachings and ideas from the Artemis cult. Now, some of you have been waiting for me to teach on this. Here we go. I'm only going to touch on it though. Paul was countering teachings and ideas from the Artemis cult that had entered the church, where women are superior to men because the women, are created first. And this is following from the story of Artemis. If you have read, where is it? Dr. Sandra Glahn talks about this in her book, Nobody's Mother. I was familiar with the story of Artemis and her brother Apollo because years ago as a kid, I used to love reading Greek and Roman mythology. So I was aware of Artemis. And in the story, Artemis and Apollo's mother, Leto, became pregnant. She gave birth to Artemis first. So Artemis was the firstborn. Artemis and Apollo basically are twins. They are, I think it's called fraternal twins. And so Artemis was born first, and then Leto was in agony trying to give birth to Apollo for 9 days. And she was having a difficult time. And even though she was 9 days old, Artemis, whose father was Zeus, her father was a god, Artemis helped her mother give birth to her brother. So the idea is that the woman, Artemis, came first and helped to bring forth her brother, the man, Apollo, second. All right. So let me read to you what Dr. Sandra Glahn has to say in her wonderful book, Nobody's Mother. I hope to interview Dr. Glahn one day. She says on page, this is 142, as was established earlier, the traditional view of the church has been that Paul's reasoning for limiting women's speech is because women are more easily deceived than men. So now we know we're dealing with chapter 1 Timothy 2, 13 and 14. More recently, the rationale has shifted from Eve's deception, extrapolated to all women. Eve was deceived, therefore all women are more susceptible to deception. The rationale has shifted from Eve's deception, extrapolated to all women, to the creation order of Adam and Eve, with Adam, the first, being preeminent. So again, it's the idea that what has shifted is, rather than focusing on Eve's deception, we're focusing on the fact that Adam was created first. But quote, Adam was formed first, not deceived, should not be understood as a male first creation order that equals hierarchy, either in this world or the next. Rather, by the way, there are some who believe that men are going to be in charge not only in this world, but in the world to come, in eternity. I actually read a guy who's complementarian who believes that. Rather, the truth that Adam was first and Eve was deceived, restore interdependence in a context in which pride of creation order in a goddess first context emphasizes preeminence and autonomy. So let me break this down for a second. So Artemis was the goddess, one of the premier gods, if not the premier god, who was worshipped in Ephesus. She was highly esteemed in Ephesus, and she was worshipped. Dr. Gahn and many scholars believe that behind what is going on in Ephesus is problems stemming from members of the Ephesus church who used to be in the Artemis cult, and that they are being influenced. They've brought some of these ideas, or they have been influenced by ideas from the Artemis cult. One of them being this idea that the goddess came first and then her brother. So it's a goddess first, woman first mindset. In the Ephesians story, Artemis is first. It's one of her titles. In her own creation story, now Mike Winger had a problem with it. He says it's not a creation story, it's a birth story. But Dr. Glahn is using this within the sense of her creation story / her birth stories, not the creation of the world. But I think in the story, I think there's a word called the theogony of the gods, which deals with the creation of the gods in the Greco-Roman world. And I believe in that story it deals with not only the creation of the God, creation of the universe, and in that story there is the talk of the gods being born. Okay, but in her own creation story, with this female male pairing, she is firstborn. So in the stories I shared with you before, Artemis is born first. 9 days later, her brother Apollo is born, which means that so you have the woman coming first and then the man. Paul's Lord Jesus was begotten, not created. And he was firstborn over all creation. So there is no parallel creation story of his, Jesus, beginning. But in the creation of humanity, the Genesis story, the man is first in a male-female pairing. So in the Genesis story, from Genesis 1 and 2, we see that the man, especially Genesis 2, the man is created first, then the woman. So in the Genesis story, the man is first in male-female pairing, and he was not even the one deceived, which we again see in chapter 3. The apostle corrects what Paul is doing in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14, according to Dr. Glahn. The apostle corrects a false story. Artemis was born first and then Apollo, so this would make her superior because she is first. The apostle corrects a false story with a true one. He is using a narrative to counter a competing narrative, okay? So Paul uses the narrative of the Genesis story to correct possibly a narrative story where those who used to worship Artemis, some of that teaching had come in, saying that, well, Artemis was first, that makes her superior. She was born first before Apollo, so that makes her, the woman, superior to the man. Now, again, there are those who push back against this. There are even some egalitarian scholars who push back against this because they say, well, I'll tell you why in a second, but there are some that says, well, yeah, the Artemis story, what does that have to do with the creation story? Well, it's because that Artemis was created first. And we say, well, that's not behind this. It could be because Artemis was born first. And if Paul uses first, that would mean that those who were listening to Paul understood something about what first would mean within that context. And if Artemis was born first, Ephesus was considered the first city. Cities could be called first. Dr. Glahn talks about that in a book. I've read this elsewhere. Cities could be called first, meaning they were more honorable. They were preeminent. They were superior, depending on the context of what they were talking about. So Artemis being born first would imply that she was the superior one, thus women were superior to Apollo, thus to other men. And as I said, there are those who push back on this. Even some egalitarian scholars don't hold that the Artemis cult is behind this and that there are ideas from Artemis. Let me read to you from Dr. Lucy Pepiot in her book, Rediscovering Scripture Visions for Women, Fresh Perspectives on Disputed Texts. This is page 145. Let me find it for you. She talks about this in the book. I'm just going to, and like I said, I'm not going to go into great detail, but I like what she said here. She said, there are some who still resist this view, Dr. Glahn's view about there being behind Paul's words, the Artemis cult, some Artemis teaching / what I would call theology. There are some who still resist this view. She deals with some complementarians. For example, Thomas Schreiner, a complementarian author, writes that there is no clear evidence in Paul's letter that the Artemis cult played a role. Paul did not mention the cult, nor is there any specific notion in the text that shows the influence of the cult. She says, I am unclear as to why there is still resistance to this view, as there is compelling evidence that the Artemis cult lies behind this text, and the discovery of this has led to much clarity of some of the most thorny issues. Okay? She makes a very good point. Usually the argument that I have seen is there's no mention of the Artemis cult in the story. But and this is usually by complementarian authors, some egalitarian scholars will say that, though they will offer some other reasons why it may not be. But what I see most from complementarian scholars and authors is that they say, well, she's just simply in the story, Artemis is simply not mentioned, and her cult is not mentioned. But as I said, complementarian authors, as we saw earlier, will say, well, this is what the text says. It's like the text doesn't say that. There's nowhere in the text. So they will allow that for their interpretation, but not allow that. We do know that the Artemis cult was taking place. It was happening during that time period. We do know that Artemis was highly esteemed by many people. So is it possible that behind Paul's words, that he is dealing with the Artemis cults and responding to some of these things because some of these teachings, these ideas is arising from the Artemis cult and some of the ideas that people may have had about Artemis? It is possible. It is possible. I don't think we can just simply dismiss it because the Artemis is not mentioned. And in terms of Paul not mentioning Artemis or her cult by name, when I first heard that, when I first read it, when people were saying, no, the Artemis cult doesn't work because Paul never mentions Artemis, I immediately thought, well, Paul is a good Jew and he wouldn't mention Artemis. Why? Go over in your Bible to Exodus chapter 23, and I heard Dr. Glahn say the same thing, so I know I was in good company. Exodus chapter 23, and we're going to look at verse 13. Why would Paul not mention Artemis? Exodus 23, verse 13, God says, and in all that I said to you, and in all that I said to you, be circumspect and make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your lips. That's the New King James Version. God told his people Israel that you are to make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your lips. If you will look through the New Testament, Jesus, any Jewish author, any Jewish speaker never mentions the names of other gods. Now, Luke does, but most people agree Luke is a Gentile, not Jewish. But you don't see Paul mentioning the name of other gods. You don't see Jesus mentioning the name of other gods. You don't see Peter. You don't see James. You don't see Jude. They don't mention the names of other gods. Why? Because in the Torah, it is explicitly stated, you are not to make mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your lips. So it doesn't surprise me that Paul would not mention Artemis in the text. Now, like I said, there are other egalitarian scholars who don't believe you have to appeal to the Artemis cult in order to explain the text. They don't believe that there's a good case for that. I would say that they have some good explanations for that. But my argument is, if you simply say it was because Paul didn't mention the name of Artemis, there's a good reason. As a good Jew who follows the Torah, Paul is a Pharisee, there's no way he's going to mention the name of another God. Okay, so that is the second one. I think it is plausible that could be behind the text, and we're going to explore that a little bit more, especially when we get to verse 15. We're going to go more into Dr. Glahn's work on that. But it also, I think, is plausible as to why Paul is saying what he says in verse 13 and in verse 14. As Dr. Glahn said, again, let me repeat what she said. Let me go back to what she said, that what Paul's doing here is the apostle corrects a false story with a true one. He's using a narrative from the story of Artemis and how she was born to counter a competing narrative. Plausible, possible, plausible. All right, number three. Gotta hurry up here. Paul is dealing with a Gnostic or a pre-Gnostic teaching which inverts the original creation story and has Eve created before Adam, giving Adam life and teaching life. Let me say it again. This is the third egalitarian view. Paul is dealing with a Gnostic or a pre-Gnostic teaching which inverts the original creation story in Genesis chapter 2. And in the Gnostic or pre-Gnostic, it may have been before Gnosticism fully formed. That's what I mean by pre-Gnostic. And Gnosticism was a form, it was a philosophy that was developed much later. But there are many scholars who believe that there were pre-Gnostic teachings developing within the first century, very speculative teachings. And sometimes they would use Jewish stories to perpetuate their teachings. And so, and we do see this, by the way, later on, they take some of the biblical stories and they invert the stories, change the story, twist the stories to bring forth their philosophical beliefs. So there are stories about Adam and Eve in the Gnostic teachings. Marg Moscow writes about this on her website in an article entitled Adam and Eve in Ancient Gnostic Literature in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. So let me give you that name again in case you want to go look it up. Adam and Eve in Ancient Gnostic Literature and 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. Marg states in that article, in other articles on this website, I have suggested that the heresy in Ephesus, which motivated Paul to write his first letter to Timothy, was a syncretic heresy, some of which involved the mishandling of Old Testament law. I have also previously suggested that 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14 was written to correct heretical ideas concerning Adam and Eve. Now, this is also in alignment to what we just read that Dr. Glahn wrote, and actually Dr. Glahn cites Marg in her book, that this was also a view of Dr. Glahn that she was putting forth, that we're dealing with some heretical teachings concerning Adam and Eve. And of course, the story of Adam and Eve is in Genesis, which is part of the Old Testament law. So this is what Marg writes. She writes about this. You can go read her articles. Some very good articles. So I suggest going to her website, get this articles, so that way you get access to all of the other articles, and it's free. You can go on the website and read all the different articles. Now, the biggest difficulty that many scholars, complementarian and egalitarians, have with the Gnostic idea and appealing to the Gnostic stories is that many of the stories are later than 1 Timothy. They're much later. They're anywhere from 100 years to 200 years later than Timothy. They're written after Timothy. However, Mark has stated something when I remember when I first heard this, I went, well, I thought the same thing. And then I read Mark said it. She stated that it could be, though, that these stories were originally oral traditions, which were later written down. We know this is true. Number one, of the Bible itself. A lot of the stories in the Bible were oral traditions, and then they were written down. Jesus' stories, many of them were oral traditions that were passed upon by speaking, and then they were written down. The ancient world was originally an oral culture, O-R-A-L. It was an oral culture, as Dr. John Walton has talked about. It was not a text-literate culture, or text culture, text-literate culture, meaning that they relied more on the spoken word than the written word, though they would write things down. So the Gospels, originally a lot of it were oral, spoke things that were spoken orally, then they were written down. We know in rabbinic literature, a lot of rabbinic literature that may be dated later, some of it it is writing down things that were said in an earlier period. It just was recorded later. So is there a possibility that some of these Gnostic or pre-Gnostic stories were originally oral that were floating around within the first century, but then later written down? It's a possibility. We can't prove 100% it was, but you can't prove 100% that it wasn't. I'm talking about all of the story. Some of them you may be able to date more specifically, but it could be that some of these stories were written earlier. Some of these stories have Eve being created first before Adam. It would be great if we could find something that would absolutely prove this point, because there are stories where Eve is created before Adam, and Eve instructs Adam in the story. There was one story I was reading before we started where Eve was created before Adam. Adam actually wasn't alive yet. Eve brings him to life, and she is called the instructor of life. Okay, so when I first read that, I went, whoa, if this could be behind the 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. It's a reversal of the roles. We see rather than Adam being first in the Gnostic stories, it is Eve that is first, and then Adam is created, and Eve instructs Adam. Could it be that once again, like Dr. Guan is saying, and as Marg suggests, that what Paul is doing is pointing them back to the original story in Genesis, the true narrative, and saying, no, this is the way that it is supposed to be. Okay, so again, possible? Yes. Plausible? It's plausible. It's plausible. Like I said, the only difficulty is that some of these stories, as Dr. Craig Keener has talked about too, some of these stories are of a later date. And that's what makes it difficult, if not impossible, for us to just go, yes, this is true. But it could be we're dealing with oral traditions that are earlier. All right, number four, fourth egalitarian view is verse 13 and 14 is simply restating the creation order. That's all it's doing. It is simply restating the creation order and the sequence of events that happen in the creation of Adam and Eve, and it is simply a setup for verse 13, for verse 14. So verse 13 is simply a recreation, a summary of the creation story, and really the point of it is to set up verse 14, okay? Taryn Williams has this view in his book, How God Sees Women. So let me read to you what Taryn says in his book, page 139. Now, I know I'm sharing with you a lot. You might have to go back over this and watch it again to get all of it. But I just wanted to give you all of the egalitarian views. And we got one more to share, then I'm going to share my take on this. Taryn Williams, How God Sees Women, page 139. And this is what he says. Complementarians believe that the word first, the Greek is protos, implies first in rank. But what if Paul is here, and by the way, the word can refer, it can mean first in rank. But what if Paul is referring here to first in sequence, which it can also mean, without any connotation of rank? What if it's just talking about first in sequence? The same word is used to describe John, who got to Jesus' empty tomb first, and to the fact that God loves us first, after which we love him in response. In fact, a form of the same word is used twice in the surrounding passages, 10 verses before and also 10 verses after, to refer to first in sequence. I urge you then first that prayers be made for all people. That's in chapter 2, verse, I think 2. And then also, let them also be tested first, then let them serve as deacons. And I think that's chapter 4 or 5. So if Paul is not suggesting Adam's rank over Eve, then why does he only refer to the sequence? One compelling answer is that he is setting up in verse 13 what he will say in verse 14. And remember that Paul didn't use verse numbers, so even our tendency to separate verse 13 from verse 14 is misguided to start. In the very least, he is providing a brief summary of Genesis 2. I cannot conceive of a simpler summary of Genesis 2 than the one Paul gives here. Adam was formed first, as Genesis 2, verses 4 through 20 says, and then Eve, as Genesis 2, verses 21 through 25 says. So Paul may be recalling, in as few words as possible, the making of Adam and Eve in a way that sets up verse 14. And as we will see, he wants to draw a parallel between the Genesis 2:3 account and the Ephesians women. So the view of Taryn Williams is that what verse, at least one possible interpretation of verse 13, is that it's just giving us a summary of the sequence of the creation, and it's just setting us up for what is to come in verse 14. Okay, let me read to you now what he says. He goes on to say, having read many complementarian scholars, I have noticed that they put the weight of their argument for the creation order on verse 14, but then, which I suggest they have misread as Adam's rank above Eve. But then they typically admit that they are less certain about verse 14. There are one of two ways they interpret the verse. The first is that Eve, as well as her daughters, is more vulnerable to deception than Adam. We've read that already, and his sons, and therefore women are not suitable spiritual leaders. Am I reading the right? No, I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm reading to you something I've already read to you before. I go on. He says, is it easier for women to be deceived than men? We've already covered that. Then on page 142, that's where I was supposed to read. Page 142, this is what he says. So the first possible meaning is that he's just setting up the sequence to move to he's setting it up for verse 14. And that's all that. So it's not talking about rank of Adam over Eve. So it's not talking about the rank of men over women, or how men are supposed to lead in the church and women can't. They said it's not dealing with that. It's just showing us the creation sequence as it happened in Genesis 2 to lead up to what's going to take place in verse 14 in Genesis chapter 3. The second possible meaning, here's the second interpretation, is that Paul may be alluding to the fact that in Genesis 2, God instructed Adam before Eve was formed. Adam would have then passed on the instruction to Eve. That she received this revelation via Adam and not directly from God may have made her easier prey for Satan's deception, which is why Satan, targeted her. This would then explain why it says that Eve was deceived while Adam was not. Eve's sin results from an attack on her relatively shallow level of conviction, hence a deception, while Adam's sin was with his eyes wide open, hence a rebellion, not a deception. So what he's saying here is that the second possible meaning, when it says Eve was deceived and not Adam, is that this may be alluding to the fact that God instructed Adam before Eve was formed. Adam passed on that instruction. She received it, but not directly from God. And because she didn't receive it directly from God, this made her an easier prey for Satan's deception, which is why Satan went after her. And that would explain why it said that Eve was deceived, why Adam was not. He goes on to say that Eve's sin came from an attack on her relatively shallow level of conviction, hence a deception. So he sees that the problem was that Eve was not instructed directly by God. She was instructed by Adam, and that made her have more of a shallow conviction about the command, which made her more of an easier target than Adam was. Now, he does not go on to say, therefore, all women are an easier target. He just limits this to Eve. Okay. What was I going to say with this? Oh, yeah. So the second possible meaning, his first part about being a sequence that may set up for verse 14, I don't really have a problem with that. That could be. But the second possible meaning, that Eve was targeted because she had a less of a shallow conviction about the command because God taught Adam directly, but not Eve, that I have difficulty with it, because what that ends up doing is that makes God responsible for Eve's sin, in that, why didn't he just tell Eve directly? He didn't tell Eve directly, so God left her open. And I would have a difficulty with that. And by the way, I love this book, but I just have a difficulty with that, because that makes really God responsible for Eve's sin. In that, well, because if Adam was supposed to pass it on, Adam did his work, but if Eve had a shallow conviction because God did not tell her directly, then that would be on God, not on Eve. That makes God responsible for her being open to the enemy. And again, I have a difficulty with that, in stating it like in that way. Okay. So I disagree with that. And he says it's a possible. He doesn't say it's exactly the thing. So I would have a difficulty with that second possible meaning. All right. The fifth one, this is the last one, is that Eve was not properly educated. She was deceived. And the women at Ephesus were also not properly educated, so they too are deceived. So this is the fifth egalitarian view. Eve was not properly educated, which is kind of what Taryn Williams was saying here. She was deceived because she was not properly educated. The women at Ephesus were also not properly educated, so this is why they were deceived. So what Paul is doing is drawing an analogy. He was saying Eve not being properly educated correlates to the women. There's an analogy. Eve was not properly educated. The women were not properly educated. Because Eve was not properly educated, she was deceived. Because these women were not properly educated, they were deceived. Okay? There's the analogy there. Dr. Craig Keener in Paul, Women and Wives talks about this. So where's Paul, Women and Wives at? Nope. Okay, got a lot of books here. There we go. Paul, Women and Wives. Let me read to you what Dr. Keener says from Paul, Women and Wives about this egalitarian view. He said, in terms, talking about 2:14, the third possibility is that Paul intends to connect Eve's later creation to why she was deceived. She was not present when God gave the commandment and thus was dependent on Adam for her teaching. In other words, she was inadequately educated, like the women in the Ephesian church. That's on page 116. Page 120 says, if Paul does not want the women to teach in some sense, it is not because they are women, but because they are unlearned. His principle here is that those who do not understand the scripture and are not able to teach them accurately should not be permitted to teach others. Now, again, the difficulty with that is saying Eve was not properly educated. It's like, well, Eve does seem to understand what the command was. She tells the serpent, God has said that we are not to eat of this tree, lest, and not even touch it, lest we die. Now, I know people will say, well, that's so she was not properly educated because she added something to the commandment. But how does adding, we're not even to touch it, number one, correlate to she was not properly educated? And two, if she was to actually follow that and never touch it, they never would have had this problem in the first place. So we could say, based upon later rabbinic interpretation, what Eve did was put a fence around the Torah. She put a fence around God's command that don't eat of the tree. I tell you what, don't even touch the tree. So further extending the commandment so as to make it even less likely that she was to break it. So I don't think it was necessary that Eve was uneducated, but she was deceived. Now, what about, and by the way, there are pushbacks against this view that Dr. Keener articulated. And again, Dr. Keener is one of my favorite scholars. But there are pushback by complementarians saying about these women at, again, there's pushback to this as some complementarians say that the women at Ephesus were educated, that these women were educated. And so they push back against that. No, it's not about them not being educated. And again, they say, no, it's not about them being educated. It's about the creation order. It was rated in creation. This is why they can't teach. Some will say they may not have been educated, but it had nothing to do with that. But there are a lot who say, no, these women, they were educated. So that is not a plausible reason. I think it could be a plausible reason that the women were not educated like they needed to be. I have a hard time accepting that Eve was not educated because Eve shows awareness of the commandment. And there was only one commandment. It wasn't a whole lot that Paul didn't have to go into the Greek and the Hebrew and explain culture and context and background to educate her about the commandment. It was one simple commandment. Eve seemed to have gotten the commandment, right? Matter of fact, one way to look at it that I've never thought about before, Eve may have been acting like the rabbis later. She's elaborating on the text saying, I tell you what, to make sure the rabbis would create what was known as a fence around the Torah. This was for the purpose, they would add additional teaching to make sure you don't even come near breaking the commandment. It was a way to ensure compliance and obedience to the command of God. It was not necessarily a bad thing, except when it got so into the minutia, it became a heavy burden to the people. But Jesus would say things like, you've heard that it was said that you should not commit adultery. I say unto you that even if you look at a woman with the purpose of lusting after her, you're committed adultery with her already in your heart. If your right hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. This could be seen as a fence around the Torah. Don't make sure you stay away from the things that will even move you to disobeying the commandments. Could it be that what we see Eve here doing in Genesis chapter 3 is making commentary? Never thought about this before. So some of you who are hearing this, some of my friends that say this, write your comments below what you think about this. Eve may have been making the first commentary on the biblical text. She's introducing some additional halakha, some additional commands to make sure that the commandment is not broken, though she did break it. Okay, just putting that out there. I'm not saying that is the way, but I'm just putting it out there. I never thought about that before. Let me move on because I got to finish here. I'm already over. Okay. There are those who push back to the women were educated. However, Paul states that there was ignorance at work in the false teachers in Ephesus. Go over to 1 Timothy chapter 1. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5 and 7. Paul says, now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from sincere faith, from which some having strayed have turned aside to idle talk, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. Notice what he says here. They desire to be teachers of the law, but they do not understand what they say nor the things which they affirm. There is ignorance here. They don't understand what they are saying. They don't understand what they're teaching. They don't understand what they're affirming. They don't understand the Torah. And Paul is saying, very possibly, that Dr. Keener is saying the women at Ephesus were uneducated, which would lead to deception. And this is very possible. I would quibble with Eve being uneducated because Eve seemed to know the commandments, but that the women were uneducated seems to be very possible. Excuse me, because my view is that the wealthy women were in the group were the one promulgating this teaching. They were uneducated in the Torah. Okay. Now, as I said, I'm going to deal with more in depth with the complementarian objection to some of these views. I tell you what, I've already gone over. I'm going to stop right there because I don't want to overload you. And I know somebody like, oh, Mike, you said you were going to share. I've already shared a lot. Next week, now that we've gotten through the 5, I didn't think I was going to be able to get through all this. We've gotten through the 5 basic egalitarian views of chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. There are aspects of it I agree with. There are aspects of it, and some of them that I don't agree with, but they are possible. They are plausible, okay? What I will do next week is share my view based upon my studies of this, which will take in some of what was said here, and in some ways, I think we'll move into a different direction. So I know I'm leaving you on a cliffhanger. Some of you might be hating me right now, but you got to love me because we're brothers and sisters in the Lord, and it's a commandment. So I will be back next week, at Lord willing, and I will share my view of this. We'll have more time and I won't feel like I have to rush. All right. So thank you for joining us. If you have enjoyed this, what I'd like for you to do is to share this video with other people. If you're watching this on YouTube, I ask for you to subscribe. That helps to grow our YouTube channel. It helps the algorithm to push this to more people. We want this information to get out there because there is information out there already that have been shared by other complementarians who have large followings like Mike Winger, and which this is no bad thing on him. He's built it up. He's done a great job. We want to get more of this out because he has shared his views on women from a complementarian perspective. I'm seeking to do that from an egalitarian perspective in a very systematic way, taking each point a little bit at a time so that you can have a greater understanding of what is being communicated about men and women in the biblical text in a cultural and biblical context. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share this video with friends. All right. Thank you for joining us. Lord willing, we'll see you next week. And I promise, if we're here, I will share my point of view. God bless you. We'll see you next week.